Herzlich willkommen zur Gesprächsreihe Erneuerung oder Niedergang. Die Entwicklung der sozialdemokratischen Parteien in Europa 1970.
Welcome to the discussion series Renewal or Decline, the Development of Social Democratic Parties in Europe 1970 to 2020. My name is Bernd Rother, and together with my colleague Christina Meyer, I have developed this series of talks at the Federal Chancellor-Willy-Brandt Foundation, which we will be holding together with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation from today until June. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Foundation very much for supporting this project. I'm delighted that you have joined us for our online event, but I'd especially like to welcome our two discussants, Professor Donald Sassoon from London and Professor Marcel van der Linden, and also Anja Kruke, head of the Archive of Social Democracy at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Anja Kruke will moderate the discussion and introduce Professor Sassoon and Professor van der Linden at the beginning. This series of discussion is part of the Chancellor-Willy-Brandt Foundation's program to commemorate Willy Brandt's time as Chancellor 50 years ago, from 1969 to 1974. At that time, the SPD had successfully renewed itself. The programmatic repositioning through the Godesberg program allowed the SPD to emerge from the 30% tower of the 1950s and eventually to win enough voter support in 1969, nearly 43%, to take over the government together with the FDP. In 1972, almost 46% were reached, and the SPD seemed to be firmly in the saddle. The fact that this was not the case, however, and that 2 years later Brandt's chancellorship failed, not only because of a GDR spy, shows us how short-lived the success of renewal processes can be. We will explore the question of renewal or decline in 5 more talks over the next few months. On the 4th of March, the item on our agenda will be the social democracy's response to changes in the working society, the public realm, and the understanding of democracy. The significance of the social democratic guiding principles of freedom, equality, and solidarity today will be the subject of debate on the 24th of March. Special features of social democracy in East Central Europe will be discussed on the 15th of April. On the 27th of May, we will explore the question of what the future of social democratic concepts will be in a changed world order. To conclude the series on the 17th of June, Hubertus Heil, Christina Morina, and Herfried Münkler will try to give an outlook on the opportunities of social democracy by addressing the initial question, renewal or decline of social democracy. I wish us and you an interesting and insightful conversation. Please feel free to write down your questions in the chat. Before Anja Kruke takes over as a moderator, moment, I'd like to hand over to Martin Schulz, the new chairman of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. The floor is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the opening of the series of events, Renewal or Decline, the development of social democratic parties in Europe 1970 to 2020. I'm very pleased that we are organizing this series in cooperation with the Federal Chancellor-Willy-Brandt Foundation. The Foundation has chosen the overarching theme of 50 years of chancellorship for this event. Willy Brandt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1971 for his efforts to deepen Western European integration and at the same time to establish good relations with Central and Eastern Europe. The result of World War II and the ensuing Cold War was the painful division of Germany into 2 parts and the division of Europe. Overcoming this was Willy Brandt's goal. This is what he received the Nobel Prize for. And 50 years later, we still remember this with pride. Today, however, we are concerned with the renewal of social democracy after 1945. The successes and failures that have marked our movement since the end of World War II will be examined by two very important historians of the European labor movement, Marcel van der Linden and Donald Sassoon. They will analyze which strategic decisions led to the successes and the rise of social democracy from the late 1950s and the 1960s. But they will also shed light on what did not stand the test of time and led into the wrong direction. It's a deep-rooted traditional procedure in the history of our movement to critically analyze successes and failures and to draw the necessary conclusions, and it will be the foundation of our discussion today. I'm looking forward to the talk.
Ich darf Sie heute herzlich zu unserer gemeinsamen Veranstaltung mit der Bundeskanzler-Willy-Brandt-Stiftung begrüßen. Ich begrüße insbesondere.
Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you heartfully to our event today. I welcome Marcel van der Linden and Donald Sassoon. I'd like to introduce both of you quickly or briefly. I would like to start with Marcel van der Linden. He used to be the research director at the International Institute of Social History and professor of the history of social movements at the University of Amsterdam. He has worked extensively on the history of labor and workers in a transnational and global perspective, publishing countless books and articles on this. Marcel van der Linden has devoted himself to these international linkages with a view to research in the countries of the world and has promoted their transnational interconnection, both in the International Social History Association and the various networks of global and continental labor history. His most recent publications have led him to the social question in the 20th and 21st centuries, and I'm sure that this has something to do with questions of renewal of social democracy yesterday and today. Donald Sassoon is Emeritus Professor of Comparative European History at Queen Mary University of London and has held visiting professorships around the world. He has made a name for himself with major books on the history of socialism in the 20th century, but also with a history of Mona Lisa, as he has worked extensively on Italian history. His most recent research has dealt with the culture of Europe and Europe's future, and of course, with a view to Brexit. Thus, we do have two renowned experts of the history of the 20th century and the labor movement. I welcome them once more, and I am delighted and looking forward to the discussion. I would like to start our talk with give you the chance to have a short impulse speech on the development of social democracy after 1945, and I would like Marcel van der Linden to start and to tackle or center the social question of social democracy after World War II. Thank you, Anja. The victory of the Western European labor movement started back in the 20s of the last century, which we can say from hindsight, because first, it looked different when we had a look at Nazism and fascism, but after World War II, the labor movement flourished in Europe, and in the first decades after 1945, we saw the Trente Glorieuses in France, glorious 30s, all three main branches of the labor movement flourished, and consumer cooperatives developed into the 60s. Then they got into trouble due to retail changes. Trade unions grew. They reached the highest membership figures in the 1970s and 80s, and the labor parties also were well off. In western parts of Europe, except for some of, like in Spain, France, Italy, they had their climax in the 80s. The rise of the labor movements happened in a specific historic content, which should be analyzed more deeply. It was called organized capitalism, a process of positive feedback with a look at labor productivity, labor, employment, etc. This process contributed to the forming of the social state. In the richest regions of world capitalism, not only Western Europe, but also Japan, Australia, and to a less extent Northern America, there was a cumulative but also unplanned process of reforms, which ended into a relative widespread show of the working process. So we had, that was a reaction to the dangerous experiments of socialism in the Soviet Union, etc. In many families, the man was the main contributor and the wife concentrated on rearing children and household. In the 70s and 80s, this progress of European labor movement stopped. As early as in the Second World War, Michael Kalecki forecast that when there will be full employment in capitalism, the bargaining power of labor movement would grow, and this would end up in problems for the capital. And that is what we realized. This forecast was right. The average profit rates started to drop in the 60s. The economic growth started to fall or reduce, and this brought about a change from an expansionist, demand-oriented politics to a supply politics, which was against the employees. And that is the share of wages in the GDP, the labor share, decreased or has decreased since the 80s, 90s in different extents. In Germany, this unclean labor share fell from 1981 from 73.6 to 69.2. That is 4.5% losses. In Austria, it was much more in the same period. This share decreased by 9%. And the share of assets increased. So this decreasing share of the labor movement made clear that it does not mean there is more employment, and the share of those who are not included in bargaining plans sank. Today we can say, despite this successful history, the labor movement does not have a good stand globally. That is, youth parties and co-ops lost in influence. And the co-ops ran into difficulties in the 60s. Lots of them went bankrupt, and others merged with capitalist enterprises, let's say, and lost their trade union character, or they increased with a lot of members so that the members could not view themselves as co-op members anymore. And the degree of trade unionism is not good anymore in Germany. If I'm not mistaken, the organizational degree decreased from 36% after reunification to 33%, and this tendency can be viewed everywhere, not very clear in Belgium and Scandinavian countries, but this is due to the fact that the trade unions pay the unemployment benefits. On a global share, the trade union degree is unimportant, 6 to 7%. And social democratic and labor parties, they don't get high percentages in elections, and most of them reached their climax between 1945 and 89. And the more important is that those parties are faced with a fundamental identity problem that we might come back later in the discussion. This simultaneousness of the crises of labor movements in lots of countries or globally makes us think, this is my thesis, that it's not the failure of organizational leadership as the main reason, despite the fact that they did idiotic things, but general factors play a role. That is, in particular, the restructuring of international capitalism should be viewed, and this is probably one point of the discussion.
Vielen Dank, Marcel. Ich darf Herrn Sassoon bitten, seinen Impuls zu geben.
Thank you very much, Marcel. May I ask Mr. Sassoon for his impulse speech?
Yes, when the social democratic movement started as an organized force back in 1889, they had a very good way of selling themselves. They had an idea of a future, of a non-capitalist future, the long term. But at the same time, they were proposing a number of reforms. So they were actually saying to their members, their activists, those who wanted socialism, join us, and this is what you're going to get. At the same time, they were telling the wider society, we are in favor of universal suffrage, including women, the 8 hours day, etc., etc. So these two things went on together throughout the first half of the 20th century, because the socialist movement was hardly ever in power before 1945. There are Scandinavian exceptions, 11 months in France, in Germany before Nazism, also rather limited, the Labour Party, two unfortunate coalition governments, and so on. But after 1945, the left becomes really strong, and it is actually immediately in power in most countries. It then loses power by 1948, 49, 50, and we have a period of conservative rule. What is interesting is that the conservative rule of the 1950s and of the first part of the 1960s is not a conservative rule in which the conservatives undo the gains achieved by the Social Democrats. On the contrary, they accept them. So one could say the agenda had gone to the left. The agenda had been established, and it was unthinkable for a conservative party, which at the time were not neoliberals. I remind you that liberal parties did not really function well in Europe. The opponents of social democracy were Christian Democrats, were or Gaullist, nationalists of some sort. So you did not have a neoliberal force. You had two forces which were in the business of controlling capitalism in some sort of way. This led in the 1960s and 70s to the return of the left, of social democracy, of the Labour Party, of the SPD. In Italy, the Christian Democratic Party had to open to the left with the acceptance of a socialist in the coalition. In France, they had to wait in 1981 with the victory of Mitterrand. So on the whole, we have a return of the social democracy. Now, it is always much easier to be an opposition party, especially an opposition party which has no chance of becoming government, because then you can say anything you like. You can make any kind of promise. When you are near government or in government, you are faced with constraints. You are faced with the hard and harsh realities of the economy. And this is what happened in the 60s and 70s, and in some cases, I'm thinking of France in particular, in the 1980s, where, for instance, the idea that you could reflate the economy as Mitterrand thought he could do in 1981 just did not work. the French economy reflated, but no one else did. And so they had to go back and undo some of the stuff that they had been doing. The problem facing social democracy has always been that, in a way, it is faced with the constraints of capitalism. And when capitalism works, as it did pretty well in the famous first 30 years after 1945, then there is plenty of money and you can have a national health service, a welfare state, and all these kind of things. When capitalism does not deliver the goods to that extent, then you have to go back. So the constraints of capitalism were a first important factor which mitigated on the growth of socialist parties. On top of that, you had another problem, namely globalization. We may want to return to that, and that is that it was increasingly difficult for socialist parties to rule a single country, to create even social democracy, even reformism in a single country when the international economies were constantly interconnected. Finally, the third problem is that the demographic composition of each country changed remarkably. Now, as I speak, the working class in its traditional form in Britain is 11%. In other words, the traditional base of socialist parties has evaporated, has nearly all gone. And this explains in part the dramatic fall of membership of trade unions, which is not just in Germany, but as Marcel pointed out, it's all over Western Europe. And this fall in trade union membership is also reflected by the fact that trade union members are increasingly, as a percentage, state employees. In other words, they're not facing a nasty capitalist who is trying to screw them. No, they are facing the state, and that adds to the number of problems. After 1980, the birth or rebirth, if you want to, but I call it the birth of neoliberalism, meant that socialist parties had to adapt to that, had to make compromises, had to appear to be not too much out of sync with what was the new agenda. So while in the 50s, the agenda was on the left, in the 1980s and 90s, the agenda was on the right. And this caused problems because those who did not like this agenda, those who felt they were the losers in this, did not have anyone to turn to. And this in part explains the surge of the far-right parties, of nationalist parties, of xenophobic parties in the last 20 years or so. So the prospects for social democracy are bad because it's not only social democracy which has got problems. Traditional centrist, center-right parties have also got problems. In Italy, the Christian Democratic Party has disappeared. There is no stable party system in what used to be the most stable party system. In France, Macron is not the expression of a traditional political party. He's a novelty. At the last election, not only the SPD in Germany had the lowest vote it ever had, but also Angela Merkel, CDU, had the lowest vote it ever had in its post-war history. And indeed, socialist parties in Sweden, but in Iceland, nearly everywhere, have obtained the lowest results, in some cases dramatic, lowest results of their entire history. So the prospects are for traditional parties in Europe are pretty bad. And so we are facing an era of dangerous instability.
Vielen Dank. Ich glaube, damit haben wir jetzt einen
Thank you very much. I think this opened a wide scope which allows us to pick various subjects and questions. I would love to start from a point which you both mentioned, the connection. So both of you mentioned globalization as an issue. I would like to ask you about the inner contradiction of the labor movement as national projects with an internationalist endeavor facing the challenges of Europeization. I don't know, who of you would like to make a start? I can say something. Okay, Donald, if you agree, let me make a start. I believe the strength of social democracy in its blossoming phase was when it confirmed in France policies and confirmed a new distribution of wages and whatsoever as a goal. The increasing economic interconnection and the enormous growth of global economy pointed out, made sure that to an ever greater extent the national economies got interlaced and that the economic development, upswings, downswings, were internationalized. And this made it more and more difficult for governments to realize a national Kenyanism. And I think this is an important problem. It shows the borders of a national economic policy. And since we just heard Martin Schulz, I think a logical thinking would be the Europeization of the social Kenyanism, which would mean to underline one European economic development. It sounds like science fiction, but maybe this is a way. Mr. Sassoon, please.
Well, yes, the main contradiction is that between parties which are national parties, which appeal to a national electorate and tell this national electorate, if you vote for me and I win and I'm in power, I will do A, B, C, D, E. Then when they are in power, they can't do A, B, C, D because, as we all agree, I mean, it's not a novelty, it's not a discovery, economies are interlinked. So some people say, well, in that case, Europe should have more powers because, after all, in spite of all the nonsense talked about the European Union, particularly in my country, as a more powerful system, actually, the powers of the European Union are extremely limited. It hasn't got fiscal powers and it hasn't got welfare powers, not alone, and of course, it hasn't got a foreign policy, but it hasn't got fiscal powers, and taxation is the essence of political power. Now, if it hasn't got this, what can one do? Can you imagine someone trying to winning election at a time like today, going around and saying, vote for me and I will transfer powers to the European Union? Can you imagine the good electors of Frankfurt, of Stuttgart, being told some of your taxes will go to Andalusia, will go to Sicily, because we are all Europeans? It doesn't work like that. It is not possible. So there is an obstacle, which is not just one of will, but it's actually a very practical, important political obstacle, which I, of course, cannot find a solution, but that doesn't really matter. Most politicians cannot find a solution. So they go on in circle, repeating more or less the same things over and over again. On top of that, we also have what I was hinting at before, the great world transformation and the shift in power of manufacturing away from Europe. And we have to remind ourselves that social democracy, traditional social democracy, is essentially a European phenomenon. There are outposts in New Zealand and in Australia, but by and large, it has remained a European phenomenon, and even worse, a West European phenomenon. The new countries which came from the post-communist bloc, from an electoral point of view, there is no real powerful, strong social democracy in any of those countries. There are different parties of the traditional right, of the neoliberal right, and so on. So the situation of social democracy is that it could become just an insular force of a few countries in Western Europe, which are not even able to agree on fiscal policies or welfare policies. In other words, my analysis is unavoidably a deeply pessimistic analysis.
Dankeschön. Wie Sie vielleicht wissen oder nicht wissen, liebes
Publikum. Thank you very much. Dear audience, as you know, the archive of social democracy is based in Bonn. And at the end of September last year, there were municipal elections where a pro-European party won more than 5% of the votes from scratch. A new party standing for transfer. And this is remarkable, since obviously there is an electorate which decides for transfer by electing somebody who would like to transfer power. But if Europe is a dilemma which cannot be solved, what other opportunities do you see? Mr. Sassoon, you mentioned the corroding basis of the social democratic parties, and the same applies for the other people's parties, the Christian democratic parties in Europe, and their basis is also getting smaller and smaller. There are two prospects you mentioned. One is the social basis, which would meet Marcel van der Linden's comments. And you mentioned diversity. From your point of view, what would be the alternative?
Well, you know, I'm a historian. I do not resolve political problems. I don't know what the hell is going to happen. I wish I did. It's difficult enough for me to look at the past and try to understand it. And the past occasionally is helpful, but most of the time it isn't, because there are new things all the time. So what can I say except to remind the people that it is important to analyze the causes of one's defeat and to try to understand why bad things are happening. And above all, to think, I'm going to use a famous sentence that the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci wrote in his prison jail in 1930. He said, the crisis is when we know that the old world has gone, but we cannot see the new world. And in this middle, in this interval, then all sorts of morbid symptoms are appearing. And so we are in the period of morbid symptoms where we can't see the next side of the next bank of the river. We could be drowning, of course, or if we're able to swim, we'll get to the other side, but we do not see the other side yet. And it's no use, at least for intellectuals, pretending that we can. Politicians are forced to do so, okay, but intellectuals have other business to do.
Okay, einverstanden. Wir reden eher über Geschichte als über...
Okay, agreed. We are talking about history more than about the future. But Marcel, let me ask you about the present. You mentioned you marked the development of the wage quota. And when we have a look at the disappearance of a classical industrial workers' strata, what is characteristic for the new social groups, and why are they not, why is the new social democracy not attractive for them? Where would you start an analysis? I think when talking about the basis of social democracy, we should go back into time. When you look at the force of the SPD in the 50s and before, was in having lots of subcultural networks. So choirs, clubs of naturalists, women's organizations, their own newspapers, and so on. And all this subculture, and here I think this was the second column, which led to the success of social democracy. This second column disappeared. Mass media like TV stations, which destroyed the social democratic media. Hamburger Morgenpost was the last SPD newspaper, I think, which was nationalized or commercialized in 1980. Pop culture and so on. Many things made this column disappear, and this destroyed the link to the traditional members and weakened these links. And the members, how do we say this in German? Volatile. These members got more volatile. This is one aspect. The other thing is, I'd like to see evidence and proof that SPD has always been a proper workers' party. Is it true that the majority were miners and industrial workers, production workers, and so on? I do not believe this. This is part of the myth. SPD has been, from the very beginning, no proper workers' party. There were lots of small entrepreneurs like August Bebel. He was an employer of 6 to 7 people, which belonged to the party. But the industrial workers, working class, got smaller and smaller because so many jobs moved over to Asia and other parts of the world. And the social democracy and the trade union movement failed to attract or to organize the new workers in finance, in trade, and so on, where the organizational quota is much lower. This is one of the challenges. The other one is that the party form as such should be discussed, because more and more we see that the parties, and unfortunately this comes true for the social democracy, are grown together with the state to an extent that they only listen to the men in the street in times of election campaigns. In other times, they just do their job from top to down. We see there are new parties of Berlusconi or in the Netherlands of Wilders and so on, which do not have members, and nevertheless they work, they function because they rest on the mass media. And we should think well about what the future of the old party form is, and shouldn't we rather think about new organizational forms? Thank you. These were various aspects, yeah, but they belong together somehow. And I'd like to comment on this, but may I ask Mr. Sassoon to ask this about the social democracy, the European socialists, like Martin Schulz pointed out in his welcome address, and love to analyze themselves and discuss their programs. So they went through various waves of renewal and of discussion processes. And in your book on the socialism in the 20th century, you had a close look at this. Mr. Sassoon, where would you say, where is there a discussion of the renewal of the socialist and social democratic parties in Europe, which would be worthwhile to be reanalyzed?
Well, I think one must be realistic about this sort of things. Most of the discussions about programs and about renewals tend in the end to be confined to the party, to the activists. They're the ones who are interested in the program. The vast majority of people do not read party manifestos or party programs, do not even know what these are. They used to get it from television, from the short speeches, bits which party leaders were putting forward in a few sentences. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. But the whole problem of renewing the party was remain confined to the party. And as Marcel quite rightly said, this is in constant decline. It's the organizations of the parties no longer work like that very much. The few moments of enthusiasm in Europe about the left have been confined to either people inside the party like Jeremy Corbyn or a new party like Syriza in Greece, which appeared to be completely new. Then there was enthusiasm, but of course the enthusiasm was confined to committed socialists anyway, not to the wider public, not to the wider electorate, and they ended up in one way or the other in a sort of disaster. Corbyn by his own party, Syriza by the electorate. So the situation is dramatic in the sense that we do not know of new forms. The party political form is a 19th century form which has been adapted a bit in the course of the 20th century, but there's nothing terribly new. And we see this even in a country like the United States, which never had really strong parties, as it were. But when you had someone like thank God he's gone now, Donald Trump, who came out of nowhere, just like Berlusconi came out of nowhere, just like Macron came out of nowhere. These are all very different people, but they no longer needed people who went from door to door, who engaged in discussions, or who went to pubs and trattoria or whatever, and started talking. They have to be able to communicate a message, and the message very often is simple. I am someone new. I'm not like them. I'm not like these old parties. I'm going to change things. That's all they needed to do. And then people will follow, not for long, because it's almost impossible to do anything new in the present situation. I mean, some American journalists had a lot of fun looking at all the promises that Trump made, and the fact that apart from decreasing the taxes to the rich, nothing else was done. No war with Mexico, and and all that. It is extremely difficult to develop a program which is appeal.
Danke. Ja, ich hatte gehofft, dass Sie uns etwas erzählen über also dass Sie noch stärker.
I thought you would probably focus more on saying that programs are the one thing, they might not be read, but that processes are connected with this, which are directed to the outside, to the external, and thus bring about some kind of change in parties. In Germany, the example most often mentioned is the Godesberg program, which didn't have an effect as a program as such, but together with a change of the culture of the SPD. And this now connects to... Please,
yeah, if I may, the Bad Godesberg program is an excellent example of a symbolic gesture. The idea that the SPD was going to implement a socialist transformation of society, and they decided not to when they had the Bad Godesberg. No one seriously believed that. Bad Godesberg was created in order to publicize the fact that we are not a revolutionary party. We're not going to destroy capitalism. We're going to implement reforms. This was the basis of Bad Godesberg. And nearly all the parties in Europe in the late 50s, either in a flamboyant way like Bad Godesberg, or in a less flamboyant way as the Labour Party did, changed their program or made sure that people would understand that they were reformist party, really reformist. They wanted to reform capitalism. Even New Labour under Blair had exactly that kind of symbolic gesture. By saying New Labour, he meant if you think that Labour is going to nationalize all the banks and and everything that moves, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to be nice and moderate and pro-capitalist. We're just going to distribute money in a more fair way.
Ja, ich wollte das auch gar nicht.
Yeah, I didn't want to deny that or question this, that it was just a symbolic gesture. I just wanted to point to the fact that there was really a difference in communication and approaching other electorates, which subsequently joined the parties and changed them. So this is like development, and it depends or is connected closely to whether there's a culture in the party, whether they have their own media and can put on mass media. So the question today is, what is the programmatic discussion required in order to adapt? You both mentioned that the central question would be that parties, traditional parties today, do not reach a connection to the people and do not represent the interests of them anymore, in order to put it bluntly. And I just try to bring in this topic of basic discussion, but I also see that time is running out and the one or the other question is there in the chat. Now you in the audience have a last chance to put forward the one or the other question that we may come back to. But I would like to, well, get back to this circle of change. What does it mean for today? Of course, I know we are in a phase where we see that lots of things are not clear. But having a look at the development back from the 90s, culture, etc., what do you think it is? I do agree with Donald completely that Bad Godesberg was confidence in or commitment to capitalism, and simultaneously in Austria, in the Netherlands, there were programmatic changes of similar case, and before that in Sweden, when they had the last mentioning of the word socialism and never again. And this confiding in capitalism is now a problem. It worked in that phase, but now that we see that economy is not going that greatly, and the wage share has decreased, and that the bargaining power, negotiating power of the labor movement has decreased, that social democracy is at crossroads. And it was said in the 80s, either social democracy wants to remain a partner of capitalism, then they have to call for cutting down budgets, rationalization, etc., or they have to redefine them and rethink this relationship to capitalism. And I think this is the core for the future. Thank you. Mr. Sassoon?
Well, we keep on talking about capitalism as if it were a monolithic block, as if it were a single thing. We all know it's not like that. There are different kinds of capitalism. There are different, in fact, that's the whole thing about capitalism, that it is a mess. It is in constant battle. It goes through crisis. It renews itself. Some lose and some gain. When I was younger, the great computer firms which were around 30 or 40 years ago no longer exist. If you look at the top 10 in the stock exchange in New York now, they are quite different from the top 10 in the stock exchange 50 or 60 years ago. So it's not just a question of being pro or anti-capitalist, it's what kind of capitalism, what are we going to do with the divisions inside the capitalist world itself? Are we going to protect our capitalism, as so many people think one can do in the European Union, or some people think they can do under some delusion in Great Britain? Or can we try to find an international way of controlling at least some sections, some parts of capitalism? What can we do about inequalities? Inequalities are growing, and they've been growing systematically in the last 30 years. They were not growing in the first 30 years after 1945. In fact, if anything, they were decreasing a bit. And of course, welfare, the general welfare, not just state welfare, went up enormously. So the paradox is that social democrats did well when capitalism did well. It did disastrously when capitalism did not do well. I mean, the worst period for socialists was after the 1929 crisis, when you had Nazism, you had fascism, you had, all sorts of, catastrophic things. Only in the United States, there was a slight change to the left with Roosevelt. So the thing we have to understand is that, yes, we need a strong economy in order to be able to spend, as it were, the money this economy is doing. But what can we do to reform the economy so that it is thriving and thriving in the general interest? This is the famous 64 million or whatever question, which no one can answer.
Auch wir heute Abend nicht. Aber ich glaube,
neither can we tonight, but there are questions which go in a similar direction from the audience. I'd like Bernd Rother to briefly report the comments and questions from the chats that we are going to try to answer in a larger round. There is one question from Daniel Maul. Why doesn't the social democracy manage to win over these lots of vast masses of people who work in precarious conditions, and why do they not join the social democracy and the trade unions? And the second question from myself is, how do you explain that throughout Europe, from the mid-90s to the 2000s, all social democratic parties followed the trend of the third way? Who would like to start?
Who would like to make a start? These are difficult questions. As far as Daniel Maut's question is concerned, it is remarkable that the trade unions, as well as the political parties, the workers' parties, were not very attractive for the precarious, and the precarious number is growing more and more. And I think maybe there is a rest of, or in other words, the traditional social democracy was the party who took a stand for the trade unionists or was interested in trade unionists. And trade union members had a certain relationship to an employer, and there were wage negotiations based on this. And these wage negotiations are not interesting for precarious people who are working from day to day, from week to week, from customer to customer. And this is difficult to organize them. And the same problem is reflected in the social democracy. I mean, there may be lots of precarious people who elect the SPD or other social democratic parties, but there's no close link to a social democratic party. And this will not come again because these links are vanishing. And the question about the third way, and this is one, Donald will definitely know an answer to this, but I think it is remarkable. In my perception, it was a continuation of the process which started with Bad Godesberg.
Yeah.
How did one of the Social Democrat leaders in the early 90s said, we have to get rid of our ideological feathers, meaning let's become businesslike. And this is why Tony Blair liked him. And I think this is another continuation of the idea that we need to adapt to capitalism. And I fully agree with Donald here that capitalism has lots of different faces, but there's also a certain essence, nature of capitalism. Otherwise, we would not need the term. And we should think about the question, how does social democracy behave towards the nature of capitalism? Maybe it sounds abstract. Maybe this is a title for a new workshop. Minimum, yeah. Mr. Sassoon, do you have an answer here?
Well, the growth of the precarious economy seems to be a novelty, but actually, at the beginning of the 20th century, the precarious economy was very big. I mean, for instance, domestic servants who were precarious because they were not in a union and they could be fired at will by their employers. They constituted quite a significant part of the workforce. So let's not think that this is an entirely new problem. No, there have always been a precarious employment. The novelty is that today's precarious employment is seen by those in it as temporary. It's something you do for a while you study, while you find a better job, while you do something. I mean, very few people start delivering food, like in England we have Deliveroo and you phone and they send you pizza and so on. That kind of stuff. People don't do that as a career. It's not like becoming a coal miner. It's something they're going to do for 3, 4, 5 years. So to them, it doesn't matter enormously if they're not in a union or not. They want certain basic rights. And here is where the European Union had achieved something in being able to establish that there should be a minimum wage, and one should try to enforce also a minimum working week. I mean, that's the kind of things which might appeal to them. But it is seen as being anti-business, and too many social democrats think that the last thing you want to do is to do anything which appears to be anti-business.
Ja, vielen Dank für die
yes, thank you very much for the attempt to pick up these threads. I think there are some more questions in the chat. Perhaps we can bundle them. And then I would add one final question. So we will not close on time at 7 o'clock, but maybe 10 past. Okay, there are several questions concerning the German Agenda 2010, social welfare legislation as it exists in other European countries. The question is, does it help social democracy to step away from this development? And a nice question, which is a nice one at the end here of Ryan Rother, is there any cause for optimism? This is really a nice final question. I would have expected questions on ecology, a question on ecological capitalism and what it does to social democratic or socialist questions on the taming of capitalism. Let's put this aside. Let's postpone this to one of the next discussions. And my question is whether the question of approval to the program of the parties and the social democrats is to act morally. Morality, what is the importance? Perhaps you could link these two questions. One final round of answers, please. Donald, would you like to start?
Yeah, okay. I mean, taking Agenda 2010 of the SPD, but also Blair, New Labour, and all that. One of the particularities, one of the problems of social democracy in the last 10 or 15 years, or even 20 years, is that it has been a conservative force. Now, I don't want to say anything in a pejorative sense, but the conservative force, they were defending the gains of the past. They were defending what had been achieved. They were saying, vote for me, and I will preserve this, preserve this. In Britain, defend the National Health Service, and so on. In France, the working day. Now, that is fine. I mean, one must defend whatever one has achieved in the past, but it also shows the inability to look forward to the future. And I want to bring in, if I may, the ecological problem, because it is a beautifully complex problem. Nearly everybody, except Donald Trump and a few idiots, agree that there is an ecological crisis. everybody agrees that there is such a thing as global warming. Everybody agrees that something has got to be done. The problem is that whatever is being done will damage the interests of someone somewhere. And it is rather difficult for a political party to pinpoint who is going to pay for the changes which are necessary in order to reduce global warming, in order to resolve, or at least in part, the ecological crisis. Not only the fact that it's got to be done at a much wider global international level, so there is a problem there, but that actually it is like taxation. I mean, everybody accepts that, of course, one has to pay taxes, otherwise we won't be able to have healthcare, pensions, police, and all the rest of it. But who pays the taxes? How much pays the taxes? Who gets away without paying the taxes? And the same is with the ecology. Who is going to suffer? Me, my neighbor, the one down there? That is the issue, which is extremely difficult to resolve. So on the one hand, there is the conservative battle to keep the gains of the past, and the other one is the objective difficulty in trying to find out where can we possibly go. On the question of optimism, I'm afraid I have to admit that I'm a pessimist. That is, I understand that if everybody lost hope, then it's really the end of civilization as we know it, that people need to hope that things are going to improve. But I find it myself quite difficult to keep this hope. And it doesn't matter for me, I'm older, but I'm thinking of my grandchildren, my children and my grandchildren.
Dankeschön.
Marcel. Thank you very much, Donald. Marcel, okay. Hartz IV, social welfare agenda in Germany, I think the party should step away from this now. It was an enormous mistake. It was a giant mistake, not from a political point of view. For German capitalism, it was good, but for the party, it was stupid. And it gave the party the image of kind of a asocial figure in some circles. This is my experience from discussions with German citizens. And I'm of the opinion the party should find a more social position than it did in the last decades. Concerning optimism, I think when you see this big, we are at the end of a cycle. The cycle started at the end of the 20th century with the start of the socialist movement in all its endeavors. All these different forms disappeared in the past, or they were weakened. We are in a phase of transition. Not just the workers' movement, the social democratic movement is in a crisis. At the same time, we have a problem, a political one, that if we want to achieve a bit more than is possible on a national level, we are lacking an address. And you see this in many international social movements, that the demonstrators, or you know, the 99% and so on, stand up with negative demands. We do not want this, we do not want that. There is not the solution of doing something positive because there's no address. Or you can say the different governments have to cooperate in harmony. We all know that this is difficult. So we are in a twofold transfer phase. And let me finish with a little bit of optimism. There's an independent research institute in Washington, DC. The name is Pure Research Center. In October 1990, they carried out a survey among tens of thousands of American citizens. And the result was 42% of the American citizens thinks positive about socialism. And among those who are in favor of socialism, 31% think that this is a more generous society. or that the result would be a more generous society. And 10% say that it is important then that the government takes care for the citizenship in case of health problems, joblessness, and so on. And now, when you read the report thoroughly, you see that the idea of what socialism is quite vague among these people. But it means there is some desire for more equality and sovereignty in a society, even in the United States, or especially in the United States of America and in other countries of the world. And this exactly is the basis for us to carry on. Thank you very much. I would like to thank my two partners, Donald Sassoon and Marcel van der Linden, very much for the debate, for the discussion. We touched various subjects without being able to discuss some of them profoundly, but I do hope that during our series of talks, we'll be able to come to one or the other problem again. What I find very exciting is in this phase of transfer to think about the idea that social democratic parties should find a more social position and what this means and what it means that if it does, the Social Democratic Party, that nobody is interested or that the voters don't seem to be interested, and what this means for the communication and the programs of the parties. Also with a view on changing media landscapes, communications, and the desire of people to contribute to politics. This is what I would like to take home from this discussion as a perspective for our series of talk. So we got a lot of food for thinking against a historical background. We shed light on lots of historical aspects which allow us to analyze the failure and the success, and we'll continue this in other discussions. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your interest in our talk and for your contributions in the chat. And I'd like to hand over to Bernd Rother now. I'd like to say goodbye to you. Have a very nice evening. Over to Bernd Rother. Thank you very much, Professor Sassoon, Professor van der Linden, for the interesting and inspiring discussion. Thank you, Anja Kruke, for moderating this. See you again on the 4th of March. That Ms. Frank Decker and Oliver Nachtwey will discuss the reaction of social democracy to the changes in the working society. So we'll come back to the very subject which we touched at the end of our discussion. I wish you a very pleasant evening. Stay safe and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.